So we are delighted to welcome you to this webinar, which is the launch of a new campaign targeting Barclays under the banner Stop Banking on Apartheid. And we meet at a moment when the militarized violence that is required to sustain Israel's system of injustice has been on display again, as you have all seen, in its most naked, raw, and ugly, brutal form. In a way, what we wish to speak about tonight provides a wider context to that violence. What is its purpose? What are the networks of complicity around the globe that work to facilitate and enable that violence? And what are our responsibilities? What can we do to support the Palestinian resistance to bring this situation to an end? So let's begin by establishing some clear facts and realities in all of the territory of historic Palestine over which Israel exerts control. From the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, Israel enforces a system of oppression built upon one principle. As B'Tselem, Israel's leading human rights monitoring organization, put it in its report declaring Israel to be practicing the crime of apartheid, that principle is, and I quote, to cement the supremacy of one group, Jews, over another, Palestinians. This is a project of settler colonialism designed to take land from one people, to reduce that people's presence on the land, to colonize that land on behalf of the privileged group, and to establish an apartheid system of rule over the remaining Palestinian population, whilst denying the right of return to the bulk of the Palestinian people, those expelled in 1948 and their descendants. Now, you cannot sustain such a system of oppression over a people who choose not to be oppressed without the use and the continued use of systematic militarized violence. And as I said, in the past week, we have seen the latest manifestation of that violence in the bombing assault on Gaza that in 3 short days killed 44 Palestinians, including 15 children. And as you all know, as we woke up this morning, we woke up to the news that, having declared a so-called ceasefire, Israel had raided Nablus, assassinating 3 Palestinians and wounding dozens more. But this violence, of course, continues daily in less newsworthy forms, from the illegal Apartheid Wall to demolitions of Palestinian homes, to militarized and lethal repression of Palestinian protesters, and illegal detention and illegitimate imprisonment. It is worth noting this as well, in the context of the familiar mainstream narrative we have heard again trumpeted by our political leaders in the past week, most egregiously by Liz Truss in the statement she put out, centered on Israel's right to defend itself. Let us remember, let us never forget that every act of violence used to sustain and extend a system of occupation, apartheid, and settler colonialism is by definition illegitimate. It is Palestinians who have the right to resist and defend. Now, Israel's system of oppression, its capacity to sustain violence, is made possible because of its trade in arms with dozens of countries, including the UK. Banks and financial institutions like Barclays, with high street branches across the UK, facilitate this trade through their investments in and provisions of financial services to arms companies that provide Israel with its weapons and military technology. This month, PSC, War on Want, and the Campaign Against the Arms Trade jointly launched a report that uncovered that Barclays Bank hold over £1 billion of shares in 9 companies whose weapons, components, and military technology have been used in Israel's armed violence against Palestinians. In addition, Barclays provides over £3 billion in loans and underwriting to these companies. To give one example, a familiar example, these include investments in Israel's arms manufacturer Elbit Systems. Elbit Systems specialises in the production of military technology, surveillance systems, and military drones used to brutalise Palestinians in Israel's repeated bombardments of the Gaza Strip. So Barclays is therefore directly aiding and directly profiting from Israel's occupation and apartheid regime. So tonight, having released that report, we launch the Don't Bank on Apartheid campaign, a campaign to pressurise Barclays to end its complicity. So before I move to introduce our speakers, something about the format of tonight's meeting. We are hopefully going to have 3 speakers. I'm hoping that our 3rd speaker has joined us. At the end, each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. I'll introduce them in turn. We hope to have time at the end to take a few of your questions. You can post your questions into the chat. They will be seen by the moderator, and we will try to ensure that we can ask as many of those as possible, but we are unlikely to have enough time to answer all of them. And we will return at the end to give you some information as to how you can become involved and support this campaign. And our team working behind the scenes will post into the chat various links that will give you information about how this campaign will be developed and what you can do to support it. So I just want to check, Lewis, can you let me know if Badur has been able to join us?
Not as yet, Ben.
Okay, so we're still going to work at that. So what I'm going to do, we're going to slightly change the order we planned, so I apologize for that. But we are going to hear, first of all, from Fiona Ben Shakroon. Fiona is the European coordinator for BDS campaigns for the Boycott National Committee, the Palestinian coalition that leads the BDS movement. She's going to speak to us about how European campaigning against financial institutions has had an impact, with particular reference to the AXA campaign and multiple European banks that have now excluded Elbit Systems from their portfolio. Welcome, Fiona.
Thank you, Ben. And yeah, good evening to all of you. Thank you for participating to this very interesting webinar. I hope that Badur will join us, because she's an incredible speaker and she's also very expert and talented. So as Ben said, I'm the Europe coordinator of the BDS National Committee. I actually not sure if everyone knows about the BDS movement, because it's a public webinar. I can maybe quickly introduce what is BDS. So the BDS movement is the Palestinian-led movement for freedom, justice, and equality. It was created in 2005 by one of the largest Palestinian civil society coalition, calling for boycotts, divestment, and sanction as a form of non-violent pressure on Israel. The BDS movement, so in total, it was like more than 170 Palestinian organizations coming from trade unions, refugees, networks, women's organizations, professional associations, popular resistance committees, and other Palestinian civil society bodies. It's inspired by decades of resistance in Palestine, but also by the South African anti-apartheid movement or the US civil rights movement. And so it urged from non-violent pressure on Israel until it complies with international law, and by meeting the 3 key demands of the BDS movement, which is ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the Apartheid Wall, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizen of Israel to full equality, and respect, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their home and properties, as it's stipulated in the UN resolution 194. So yeah, just in case of some of us are not familiar to the BDS movement, and if you're part of PSC and members and active in War Once on CAT, I'm sure that you already know that. So as Ben mentioned, Elbit System is one of the biggest and actually one of the worst Israeli weapon company. Elbit tested its weapon on and militarized security material on Palestinian bodies and society. They export then these weapons to the world as tested on fields, which means tested on people in Gaza Strip, like it happened last weekend, on people in Jenin, in Nablus, and anywhere in Palestine. Elbit plays a key role in sustaining actually the Israeli apartheid regime and settler colonial and occupation regime in building Apartheid Wall, providing weapons and expertise. There is actually no concrete limit between Elbit and the Ministry of Defense, actually, because Elbit hire a lot of former military staff who have committed war crimes, and it's providing almost 80% of Israeli army's weapons. They have very long term contract with the Israeli Defense Ministry. And in a lot of cases, some weapons or material used by the army is fully dependent of Elbit, like the airplanes, for example, that are using the TOR program of Elbit and cannot fly without Elbit approval and support. And last thing about Elbit that is really important, and particularly for us as solidarity movement, Elbit is also having a huge role in the exportation of the oppressive techniques and expertise built by Israeli apartheid through their decades of oppression of Palestinian people. And so Elbit is selling these techniques of oppression to authoritarian regime, like to India, that is using the same techniques to demolish homes of the Muslim minority in the country, or the construction of the wall between Mexico and the US, or the feeding the anti-immigration Frontex policies at the European shores. So Elbit is really a global harm to the global population, and it goes everywhere. They don't care about military embargo, they don't care about their reputation, they just sell everything. And so for the BDS movement, Elbit system is a key campaign. And before enumerating some of the major campaign and success or impact that we had against Elbit, I would like to just briefly explain why Elbit is actually a very good target for divestment campaigns. Elbit's strategy is fast growing. Elbit buys more and more companies all the time, so they almost only buy company and almost never sell them. That means that their debt increase all the time. As soon as they keep having new contracts, investors and banks like Barclays Bank don't care much about these debts and the financial risks that are coming with it. But as soon as Elbit starts to be in a position where they face difficulties to get new contract, then Elbit will not grow anymore. And so potentially the amount of investor will go slow as well. So that means that the company might facing actually the threat of collapsing quite quickly. That means that's why it's actually a good target of divestment campaign, like the one that is initiated on the Barclays Bank, which is one of the investors of Elbit Systems. And so, as I said, for the BNC, Elbit is really a key campaign, and the BNC really believe that it's really important to focus on developing thoroughly researched, broad-based and strategic BDS campaigns that are based on three operational principles of the movement, which is context sensitivity, gradualness, and sustainability. And so that's something that have been integrated in all the work that PSC, CAT, and Warren Wants have done these last months to build the campaign, the Barclays campaigns, and the Stop Banking Apartheids. So saying that, I think I just would like now to kind of tackle and list a key. I don't like to use the word victory because the victory is the final one, but more like impacts that we had through campaigning and lobby through financial institution. The Scandinavian countries have been actually leading the divestment movement in Europe. One of the major impacts is the largest European pension funds, the Norwegian state pension funds, that decided to exclude Elbit on the basis of the Council on Ethics recommendation. So the last one has found that investment in Elbit constitute an unacceptable risk of contribution to serious violation of fundamental ethical norms as a result of the company's integral involvement in Israel's construction of a separation barrier, Apartheid Wall, on occupied territory. So this, as the largest European pension fund, that was like one of the main impacts that we had in Europe targeting a financial institution. And it had led to a series of divestments in the country, like the Norwegian state, the communal landspension and sorry if there is any Norwegian in the public, which I adopt, but KLP is the acronym, easier to say, which is one of the largest life insurance company in Norway, divested the week after the decision of the Norwegian state pension fund from Elbit. The Dan Watch, which is the Danish financial watchdog, also added Elbit to its blacklist of 35 companies that are disqualified from investment due to ethical consideration. This decision from Dan Watch also led to the decision of Danske Bank, which is one of the leading player in the Scandinavian financial market in Denmark, decided to follow this advice and decision, considering that, and I'm quoting, "We handle clients' interest and we do not want to put customers' money in companies that violate international standards." The Swedish AP funds, which used to manage assets of more than 800 billion kroner, which is a bit more like than $100 billion in the state pension system, fully divested from Elbit as well, a couple of months after. We go out from the Scandinavian country, we have the Dutch bank, the Germany's biggest bank, that also announced the exclusion of Elbit from its portfolio because it does not meet Dutch bank ethical standards. And at the time of the decision, around 2010, Deutsche Bank was listed among the top 10 investors of Elbit System, which was a big decision at that time. Joining the growing list of international funds divesting from companies complicit with Israeli apartheid, you have the Australia's Future Fund that decided to exclude any investment from Elbit as well. Closer from you, and due to an intense work of the solidarity movement, including those who are behind the Barclays Bank campaign now, it's the decision of the giant HSBC to pull out its investments in the Israeli arms firm Elbit Systems. That is one of the major impacts also, because HSBC is also a big bank. And a last example that I will go a bit more on is definitely AXA, as Ben mentioned, which is the example I know the best because I'm directly involved in the coalition Stop AXA Assistance to Israeli Apartheid. The coalition is gathering solidarity movement from different countries in Europe, from Italy to Spain, France, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, and Ireland. And I hope I don't forget anyone, that are directly involved in the campaign, which is still active. But we had one of a major impact in 2018, which was the decision of AXA IM, which is a fully owned subsidiary of the AXA insurance company, from Elbit Systems, because of the popular pressure. And so because of the campaign, AXA decided to work on a policy on their investment in weapons industry, and decided to then divest from Elbit Systems. And a bit later, thanks to prolonged pressure on AXA as well, AXA decided to sell almost all its shares from Equitable Holding, which was an holding investing millions of dollars in Elbit Systems and Israeli banks. And so now the campaign continues because AXA is still investing in two main Israeli banks that are directly financing the expansion of illegal settlements. And so that the campaign is continuing. But what I really want to highlight here is that all of these successes and impacts are not possible without popular pressure. They are not possible without a huge work of solidarity movements and the members of this movement to pressure this financial institution as potential future clients, as current clients, as potential shareholders, as being part of associations that are financed by the foundation of these banks and financial institutions, etc. That's really important, because we know that financial institutions will not just stop investing in dirty companies like Elbit without any pressure. So I think it's definitely very important through AXA, but on the Barclays Bank campaign, that we really build a popular movement, a popular grassroots campaign that can actually help me to mention Barclays Bank in the next webinar, where I will talk about the impacts of solidarity movement with Palestinian people pressuring financial institutions. And I will end here to see if Budur join us. I hope so.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you for establishing that important context of the history of building successful campaigns targeting financial institutions. I am delighted to say that Budur has been able to join us. I'm going to introduce her in a second. Can I just remind people, we've got some questions coming in. Please keep posting any questions you have in the chat, and we will try and answer as many as we can at the end. But I am going to deal with one now. Somebody has asked, is this information going to be available later or in written form? I think it's someone who is dutifully trying to take as many notes as possible. We will make this webinar available on YouTube, and we will contact everyone who's attended so you can watch it back. But Lewis will keep posting in the chat links to further information about the campaign, to the report, so you will be able to get further background information. And of course, at the end, we will also talk a little bit about how you can become involved. So I am delighted now to be able to welcome, joining us from Jerusalem, Budur Hassan. Budur is a writer, a researcher, and an activist. She is going to speak to us on Palestinian resistance to Israel's militarized repression in Jerusalem, which Barclays is facilitating through its investments and loans, and address how the companies that Barclays is financing are key to supporting Israel's armed violence. Budur, we are really, really delighted to have you with us.
Hi, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Sorry for coming late. Yeah, it's when we scheduled this meeting, I think 2 months ago, we thought, yeah, let's just focus on Jerusalem. But of course, in Palestine, you never know. So it's always something happens. And now we're talking just as the Israeli aggression on Gaza has yet another Israeli aggression on Gaza was waged on Friday, exacerbating an already catastrophic humanitarian condition there on a strip that has been under blockade since 15 years. And we're talking just as Israeli occupation authorities also invaded Nablus today, with full impunity as always. And basically we're seeing how the illustration before our eyes, the illustration of Israel's settler colonial apartheid regime in every possible place we can think of. In Jerusalem, where home demolitions continue, in Nablus, as I said, in other places where the Israeli High Court has been approving and greenlighting the construction of Israeli settler outposts and Israeli colonies, and the everyday violence that's waged by Israel. And obviously this violence could not possibly have been waged without corporate complicity and without a banking system that invests and that supports and that cooperates with this. And I know my colleagues are much more equipped to exactly explain what role does Barclays play in supporting and consolidating this regime of violence. What I'm going to talk about is probably just briefly it's a little bit about the layers of the more hidden, unseen violence that Palestinians go through, and then how Palestinians resist that violence. And then my colleague will probably just explain what role does Barclays play in that. But first of all, I'm just want to follow up from a point that Fiona mentioned, and it's very important, about how Israeli corporations are exporting violence, be it through surveillance or through arms trade, but particularly through surveillance. And we know how different forms of Israeli surveillance are being used against activists all over the world by authoritarian regimes, by the UAE and by Saudi Arabia, and how these different forms and different methods of violence are also being exported, as Fiona mentioned, to India and to Latin America and to authoritarian regimes in Latin America in the suppression of social movements, in the suppression of indigenous people's movements. And and obviously the fact that one of the biggest responsibles of land robbery, the JNF, is also wins or has the status of a charitable organization in the UK, unfortunately. And I know it's out beyond the scope of this particular discussion, but at least one where there is also another inspiring movement is the movement against the JNF, to stop the JNF's robbery of Palestinian land. So all of this just highlights the universal reach of these corporations, highlight the importance of us building a universal movement against it, because just to show that it's not only banks and corporations that can act beyond borders and that can export their methods of repression, but we also, those of us who are active against that, are also trying and cooperating and showing mutual solidarity in order to stop these corporations. As we said, like in terms of what it's like, what's the situation like in Jerusalem right now as we speak. We know that there was so much attention given and devoted to Jerusalem last year in the thrones of the Sheikh Jarrah movement and against mass evictions and displacement. And it was really important and very big. But unfortunately, as tends to happen when the cameras of the world go away or when there happens to be a de-escalation, although living under occupation means living under constant escalation. You're always under escalation. It's just that the escalations take different forms and is manifested differently. But in terms of escalating, it's like just continuing to live. They'll always reinvent the ways in which the occupation escalates against you. So after the movement and after the attention that surrounded the cases in Sheikh Jarrah, Israel, as it always does, finds a way to circumvent and to lower, to reduce the attention by either legally, so by delaying, by procrastinating, by saying that there is a legal case ongoing before the courts. That does not mean that Palestinians are not experiencing everyday violence in Jerusalem. The manifestations of this everyday violence include the home demolitions that happen in Jerusalem, the punitive home demolitions that happen across the West Bank. Just in the last 2 weeks, yesterday actually, Palestinians, and this is, by the way, a British tactic, a British emergency regulation that Israel continues to use in order to demolish the houses of Palestinians on allegation that a relative has carried out an attack, and then the entire house is demolished by Israel, using again the legacy of British colonialism in order to implement that. The cases of Palestinian activists who are facing the threat of losing their residency, as is the case with Salah Hamouri, a Palestinian human rights defender who's now administratively detained. The case of another Palestinian child who was arrested as child, Ahmed Manasra, in 2015, and who is under and who's under solitary confinement, who has been in jail for 7 years, even though he was arrested just at the age of 13, and Israel refuses to even grant him early release, classifying him as terrorist. These individuals just show what it's like to live under an occupation regime that denies you your humanity, that tries to dehumanize you on a daily basis. The bureaucratic burdens that Palestinians in Jerusalem live through, and these burdens that do not get covered in the media because they probably don't attract as much attention. They're not as crudely violent as the missiles and airstrikes that fall on Gaza. But their cumulative effect is just to destroy the will and the spirit of the Palestinians, or to try to destroy, because there are spirits that can never be destroyed despite all the attempts. But their cumulative effect is to try and destroy the willingness, the will and spirit of the Palestinian people through imposing an oppressive regime of permits, through revoking residency, through cutting and piercing families apart just because one of the spouses happens to be a Jerusalemite and the other happens to be a resident of the West Bank, to fragment the entirety of the Palestinian people, to place Gaza as a separate Bantustan that almost has, as if it has nothing to do with the rest of Palestine, and then divide the divided further and further. So all of this has been done and continued to be done for the last 74 years, and with individual cases. But a war like the aggression that happened, that took place against Gaza, just reminds us that, or the invasion of Nablus today, and the resistance by Palestinians through popular resistance, as has been the case in the village of Beita against the construction of the Aviator outpost, or through Palestinians reinventing, reimagining ways to be able to stay together, to live together. These events, these testify to the willingness of the Palestinian people, but also testify to the importance, the message that Palestinians are sending through their daily act of solidarity, because we're talking about a daily violence, and the response to this daily violence is also daily act of mutual resistance and mutual solidarity. What these acts of daily resistance reminds us is the importance of international accountability, of holding corporates accountable for continuing to cooperate with Israel, of holding governments accountable. And I know there was a question, and I'd love to hear the answer. I know that workers who work within these corporations or within these banks find themselves in an incredibly vulnerable situation and condition, because on the one hand, and this is not I mean, a bit different to the situation that many Palestinians who are forced to work in illegal settlements or in different arms of the Israeli government, or even construct these settlements, find themselves in this precarious situation when you're working for these corporations or working for these, and you realize that you don't want to be complicit in the violations, but you have very little choice in the matter. And I would love to actually, this question hit me when I was hearing the questions. So I'd love to hear how these people, how everyone can support, including those who if they speak up, will have to pay an incredibly high price. I just will end with a comment that Salah Hamouri said. Salah Hamouri, as I said, is a Palestinian human rights defender who is administratively detained without charges or trial. Again, yet another legacy of British colonialism, the administrative detention without charges or trial. That Salah was asked repeatedly, so you have a French citizenship and you can travel and live in France with your family, so why don't you just leave? And I mean, live without being threatened with imprisonment, without having to suffer more. And he said that I have no other place to live in. I mean, this is where my grandparents, great-grandparents have lived and continue to live, and I have no other choice. And this is actually the fact of the matter, the heart of the matter, that we Palestinians who live here and refugees who are scattered across the diaspora, it's not like we have another choice. Sometimes we say we choose to resist. In some ways, yes, we have the agency. We can just, rest on our laurels and say we just don't care. But it's just that Israel doesn't leave us with another choice but to resist its daily acts of violence, because you know the very fact of you being Palestinian mean you being under constant threat and Israel wanting to erase you. And the only response that we have against these attempts of erasure is just to continually resist with all that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Badur. And thank you for both, I think, the reminder. We are all used, after periods of intensive bombing of Gaza, of a media narrative, if a ceasefire is called, that says calm has restored. And thank you for the reminder of what calm means in those periods, for the reality of the constant daily grind of a system of violence that is, as I said earlier, required if you wish to oppress a people who choose not to be oppressed. And we thank you as well for your reminder of what always inspires us, the endurance, the samud, the continuing resistance of the Palestinian people. I'm going to turn now to our final speaker. I'm delighted to welcome a hugely important voice in the solidarity movement in the UK, Asad Brayman, the Executive Director of War on Want. And we're talking tonight about the chains of complicity, the important principle, as someone once said it very simply to me, follow the money, of what are the networks and the chains of complicity that are necessary to continue to financially sustain systems of oppression. But what Asad is going to talk to us about is the important history that we draw upon of campaigns targeting financial institutions as part of global solidarity and resistance to those systems of oppression. So I'm delighted to welcome Asad.
Thank you, Ben. Very, very kind words, and thank you also to Badur and Fiona for that really useful introduction, and of course to all of you on this sweltering day here in the UK. So as Ben said, I was asked to say a few words about the boycott Barclays campaign. That was a very integral part of the South African anti-apartheid campaign. Before I do, I just want to maybe say, highlight how critical a tactic boycotts have been in the anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles. And, you know, it's been a tactic that's been forged in the heat of political struggles, and struggles against very powerful and dominant economic and political systems of injustice. And it's why, as War on Want, we've always proudly and principally stood first with the South African people's call for BDS, as we do with the call by the Palestinian people in their struggle for justice. And it is a clear call to those with conscience to act, to not be bystanders to injustice, but active with our own agency in, as Martin Luther King once said, bending the arc to justice and recognizing that the status quo is repression. I mean, it's interesting at the moment here in the UK to hear some of our current politicians all harking on about respecting British history, and that those who vilify it should be reported for de-radicalization. Well, boycotts are about as British as we can get. And I'm sure all of us learned in school about the origins of the word boycott, you know, in the English language, coined as a result of the campaign against Charles Boycott, an agent of an absentee landlord during the Irish Land Wars, when Irish nationalists in the Irish Land League in 1880 were campaigning for land rights and for Irish peasants to be able to own their land that they farmed against the settler colonial British state. And remembering this all took place, of course, against the backdrop of the Great Famine in 1845, when more than 1 million Irish people died from starvation, over 2 million people forced to leave Ireland as a result of UK economic policies. And as the second famine was coming, the Irish people stood up and said, you know, we're not the disposables, and stood up and campaigned against that British feudal state. And of course, it wasn't just in Ireland. I mean, if we had time, it'd be great to be able to spend some time talking about that history of the boycotts. And those who look at, you know, British colonial history will probably remember, might have read about in 1890, in what was then called Persia and now in Iran, that the Iranian people boycotted tobacco, which was controlled by the UK and was impoverishing thousands of Iranian farmers. And thousands of people took to the streets and said, we refuse to smoke tobacco, which is an incredible individual and collective act to take on what was a huge economic interest for the UK. But I also wanted to quickly mention that when slave abolitionists here, including escaped slaves, were making common cause with working class people here in Britain and demanding an end to slavery, and hundreds of thousands of people were signing petitions, and remembering that the UK government actually initially refused to abolish slavery, it was working class people who in 1791 took up the call to boycott sugar produced by slave colonies. And it was an incredible campaign. Sugar sales from slave colonies fell by a half. And this was not the elites or the middle classes not using sugar. It was ordinary working people acting in an act of solidarity. And of course, very famously, I'm originally from Lancashire. It's one of my proud sort of stories I always tell about Lancashire, about the cotton famine in 1861. And it's always interesting to remember that British industrialists in both Manchester and Liverpool were clubbing together to buy warships for the Confederate South so as to protect their slave-produced cotton, even going as far as to flying cotton flags on mills across Lancashire and Yorkshire. Yet despite the mass starvation and destitution, cotton workers in Manchester met to say that they oppose solidarity, and with cotton workers refusing to handle and boycott slave cotton. And both of these acts of solidarity were a result of a call by African Americans at the time, who called on people to not do business and buy goods that were produced by slavery. And it's been a tactic that's been used by anti-racist campaigners, whether it's been the Bristol bus boycott to local campaigns targeting, businesses that were imposing a colour bar in the 60s and 70s. And in that struggle against racism, this call of boycott has been one of our most effective tools of solidarity. And we know solidarity, that word, is the most important word in the vocabulary of not just working people, but of us internationalists. And it's this act of solidarity, which in the really dark days of South African apartheid led to the Boycott Barclays campaign. And it built on boycott campaigns that had been running previously in 1958 against Kodak, against General Motors, and also our good friend Shell Oil. And I think it's also really useful for us to remember, because sometimes we think back at these campaigns and think that they were victorious overnight, right? The official campaign against Barclays started in 1969, when the South African Liberation Movement called on the British people to show their solidarity. And in huge parallels with this campaign, to end the loans that supported and enabled the apartheid regime, including arms sales. And that campaign, of course, only ended in 1987. And I just was looking at the audience, and I know many of you were involved in that campaign, which, lasted that 21 years. But I wanted to speak very specifically a little bit about the student element of that, because, part of that campaign was, of course, about students targeting Barclays branches on campus and convincing students not to bank with them. And, and there were many, many different creative tactics that were used. I mean, I still remember the idea of people going in and opening multiple accounts and then shutting those multiple accounts the very next day to create economic drains, to hit Barclays economically on their resources. And whether it was from sit-ins to the public awareness campaign. So when Barclays was doing public information leaflets, we were mirroring their leaflets, but this time showing statistics which showed how many Black South Africans were being killed by the apartheid regime. And of course, the importance of speakers' tools of actually connecting and telling that important story. And it was a campaign that really hurt Barclays. Their own internal document showed that they had about 25% of the student market, and that had fell to between 11 and 13%. But the fight against Barclays was always multi-pronged, combining it with actions at the AGM, but also using the example of those student boycotts to actually call on others to join the boycott campaign, whether it's from teachers' unions, faith groups to local authorities, right through to charities. And one by one, groups closed accounts, losing Barclays, and it's estimated they lost thousands of millions of pounds. Nobody's quite worked out how much they lost during that whole campaign, and of course suffered huge reputational damage. And it was this combination of real policy analysis with campaigners armed with shadow reports, very similar to the information that has been produced by War on Want, PSE and CAT, and then which showed the scale of Barclays investments, including the arms trade, and how they were profiting from repression, combined with popular campaigning and advocacy. And I think just on that point that Badur was mentioning, it's important for us to remember, even at that time, that actually we worked with the Union for Bank Workers at the time, so that they knew our campaign was not targeting bank workers in Barclays. In fact, there were union branches who actually expressed their support of the campaign and were actively raising that issue of Barclays' complicity in apartheid internally within the banks and within the bank. And of course, look, there were many other banks that were supporting the apartheid regime. I still remember having a meeting with Barclays, and they were like, "But why are you targeting us? Look at Lloyds Bank. Aren't they also involved?" And this is where I think one important lesson that we have to never forget that our real target is the apartheid regime, and that targeting Barclays, like we're doing now and like we did in the past, allows us to tell a story about how a bank, like other corporations, are complicit in repression and arms sale to the apartheid regime. And they also, really importantly, provide people with a way of demonstrating solidarity. And often when we look at, like the latest wave of attacks on Gaza, people feel powerless. Okay, I've marched, I've stood on the street. What do I do? What can I actively do that feels like it has an impact? And that these campaigns provided that opportunity. It lets us, of course, also then draw the connection and tell a wider story that apartheid is only able to be sustained because of the complicity of both UK government and UK companies, and that without their support, the apartheid regime would fall. And bit by bit, we began to peel away that institutional support that it has. And of course, none of this, like this campaign, as Badur said, would have been possible, firstly, without the huge sacrifice and struggles of the South African people. And of course, none of this wouldn't be possible without the ongoing resistance of the Palestinian people. But as Badur said, it's not just corporate elites and corporate giants who can work across borders. Actually, this idea of international solidarity means we can actually escalate and provide templates for others around the world to join the campaign globally. And as Fiona was saying, that's really important because there are some lessons for us to remember, right? That, there's a danger of throwing the net too wide, but also the importance of thinking smartly. How can we learn from our successes, such as our campaigns against G4S, and show that actually taking action against these corporate investors does win, and we can win. And I think that's really, really important for us to tell. And, each story tells and allows us to build upon that, whether it's, the largest Dutch pension company pulling out its investment in terms of the apartheid regime. These are all opportunities, but they're also an opportunity, I think, like we did with the apartheid, with the Barclays campaign during the South African anti-apartheid struggle, is to make common cause with other movements as well. And I think for anyone who studied corporate campaigning or boycott campaigns, know that financial institutions, but especially those with a public footprint, the thing they fear most is being targeted by public consumer campaigns. And I think this is a really opportune moment for us. By targeting Barclays, it also provides us an opportunity to tell a bigger story and make connections, and can make the connection between the struggle of the Palestinians, not just in terms of the repression, but also the issues around land, environment, climate, etc., by linking up with other climate justice campaigners who are also targeting Barclays because of their funding of fossil fuels, including the Mozambican gas pipeline. Look, I think I've run out of time. I just want to say how important the launch of this campaign is, but all victories are only possible by us going out and building outwards. And again, the Barclays campaign was a very, very important way of building the broader solidarity movement and the anti-apartheid movement. Often people now look nostalgically back and everybody says, I was also a part of the anti-apartheid struggle, and maybe in 1986 or 87, they might have come on one of the big marches. But those hundreds of thousands of people that marched in the streets of London, they were built by these kind of campaigns. They were built by having targeted individual campaigns, targeting different elements of the apartheid regime. And I really believe that together we can, again, have a victory. And I hope it won't be 21 years. I'm sure in a matter of years, we should all be meeting and saying, well, we've taken down Barclays investments. Who do we go on for next?
Thank you, Assad. And a crucial reminder, we are all conscious, I think, of the resonance of a campaign against Barclays. When I was a student in the 1980s, I'm not as young as I look, anybody with progressive values would not bank with Barclays, and the student involvement in that campaign was crucial. But also what Assad has told us, it's important to remember the importance of boycott and divestment historically as a tool of justice, as a tool of solidarity. And we remember that, of course, in the context of something we're not addressing tonight, but we're all very conscious of, the government's attempt to bring in an anti-BDS bill. And of course, we all remember the last time a Conservative government attempted something like that was directly to stop people trying to divest from South African apartheid. We've got time, I think, to take two, possibly three, but certainly two questions. I'm sorry to say Badur has had to leave us because of technical difficulties, but she sent her thanks to the meeting before she left, and I know in return we all send our solidarity to her. So I'm going to take two questions. One, I think, gets to the very heart of the question of what we're trying to do here. So it's this, very simply, what impact would Barclays divesting from these arms companies have? So if that's what we're trying to achieve, then what will that mean if we are successful? I don't know who wants to take that one first. Fiona, shall I come to you first?
Yes, you can hear me? Okay, yeah, it was my turn to have an issue to unmute myself. Sure. That's indeed a big question and a key question. And I think somehow Assad already answered partially to it. We are building a movement, and we cannot achieve the S of sanction without having the B and the D, having success in boycotts and divestment campaigns. And so having a success or an impact on Barclays Bank and having them divesting from Elbit is another step to reach the sanction in building a popular movement and a grassroots movement to put pressure. It's also a step to have another financial institution that are not supporting anymore Elbit system. And as I mentioned, Elbit is one of the biggest and the worst weapons company, very involved and in the sustainability of the apartheid regime. I also think that decision of financial institution and banks as Barclays banks, as AXA, as BNP Paribas, etc., have an impact on their fellow banks and their friends, I would say. You can see in diverse and different BDS campaigns that actually more and more impacts you have. You can also observe that other companies are more and more afraid to invest in Israeli apartheid because it's not good anymore, because they are very afraid about their reputation, because they're really afraid about financial risk, because they don't want to lose investor, they don't want to lose support. And so I really think that what we need to think is that we are planting seeds that are growing and becoming trees, and then we are having a forest, and then the forest is growing, and then we're gaining more and more, I would say kilometers. And that's really important. And having Barclays divesting from Elbit would be a very great impact in the UK, but also internationally for the biggest and the international campaign targeting Elbit system.
Thank you, Fiona. Assad, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Just to add, you know, again, I think it's useful, as Fiona said, important to think about these as steps, right? I mean, we again are in, when we look back at the anti-apartheid struggle, you know, we focus on the end moment when we say, well, the global international community, you know, had UN sanctions and arms embargoes, etc. We've got to remember that that wasn't the state in the 1950s. It wasn't the state in the 1960s, the 1970s, etc. That was built because of these individual campaigns, and the pressure was building and building and building. And that's where we've got to see our ultimate goal, of course, is to create, to end apartheid and ensure we have a society based on human rights, justice, equality, etc. But to get to that, and in terms of ensuring, for example, that not only is it just Elbit, but actually we go from Elbit to pushing also about the UK having a two-way arms embargo with Israel, requires us to be able to also to build from one to the other, and see these campaigns as being connected in part of a wider struggle about raising public awareness and ensuring that we keep this space open and moving forward.
Thank you, Assad. I'm going to take one more question for Assad and Fiona, but just one which I'll address, and if there's anything that Assad and Fiona want to add to this one, otherwise we'll move to the final question. But somebody has asked an important question about what will happen, or what can happen within this campaign to reach out to employees of Barclays who may not have the choice or the capacity to speak out, and may not understand why the bank is being targeted. Let me give an answer to that, and this is a familiar and a legitimate issue. On the recent campaign that we ran in relation to HSBC, what we did to address that during this campaign is we actually held workshops with shop stewards from Unite, who are affiliated, Unite Union are affiliated to PSC. And we held extremely successful workshops where we met with huge numbers of shop stewards from HSBC to explain exactly what the campaign was about, why we were undertaking it. And that empowered and enabled them to be an internal voice, putting the concerns of staff to the company. So we are looking to do something similar. We're having similar conversations about what we can do through those mechanisms to reach out to people who are employed by Barclays. I don't know if Assad or Fiona want to add anything to that. If not, I think we'll end with this question, which I think gets to the heart of the challenge that's often put in relation to campaigns like this. So it's the straightforward question: well, if Barclays divest, won't other banks or financial institutions simply just pick up the shares instead? It speaks to something, I think. Assad, do you want to start with this one, because it's the reverse side of the question that a bank sometimes put, why us, what about the others? But this is saying, well, look, if we win a campaign in Barclays, surely somebody else will just pick up the slack. So Assad, do you want to take that one first of all?
Well, actually that's not the case, right? I mean, you know, of course we know that there are even worse unethical corporate investors out there, right? And we see that, you know, particularly in climate, right? How some investors pulling out and then BlackRock and others moving in. But actually, in terms of major financial institutions, what it does, and I think the important part of it is it isn't simply then becomes an issue about an individual bank. It actually becomes about a policy, and a wider policy about not investing in arms trade, not investing in supporting repressive regimes. And that, of course, is a huge benefit and allows us to actually have even greater impact with our individual victories. So I would say it as actually a transformational, it's a transformational demand that actually has the ability to be hugely impactful within the financial sector. And you see that now increasingly in terms of climate campaign, right? When some people pull out, actually the whole investment or the whole pension fund says, let's have a whole policy about not investing in any fossil fuels. And that's where we, of course, ultimately want to get through. It's not only are they not investing in arms sales to Israel, they're not investing in arms sales to Myanmar, to other repressive regimes around the world.
Thank you, Assad. Fiona, to you for the last word.
Thanks, Ben. And Assad. I mean, the answer was quite complete, and I will maybe add that it's why intersectionality is so important for movement like ours. The violation, the violence, the oppressive regime are all connected to each other, and so that's super important to really connect the different movement working on the same targets or like working on the same type of oppression. And so as it has been mentioned before, Barclays is really bad environment, really destructive. And so there is a lot of climate justice movement that are active. And so it's so important to work with them. It's same for migrant movements, etc. And so I really believe that we need, I mean, our duty as European and as British people in this case is really to be sure and ensure that our financial institution, our companies, our government are not participating to any kind of violation, to any kind of oppressive, to not financing any kind of oppressive regime. And apartheid Israel is one of them, but there are many of them. They are all linked to each other. And we don't want just to end apartheid Israel, dismantle apartheid. We want to build a better society. We want to build a better future. We want to have companies that are respecting the rights of workers, the rights of women, the rights of minority groups. And so that's really important, that when we target, we have this kind of campaign that is indeed one of the target among others. We see it as a step, as just a part of a more global fight and struggle for justice, for freedom, for equality everywhere. And so I really believe that it's not a question of individual institution, I mean, financial institution. It's really like how to build a momentum and a space where actually there is no way in the future for financial institution to invest in any companies participating to similar crimes and violation of international law.
Thank you, Fiona. I want to thank on your behalf all of our speakers, Badur, Assad and Fiona. Apologies for those whose questions we've not been able to get to, but I would encourage you, Lewis will put an email into the chat if he hasn't, where you can send your questions in if you would like to have a direct answer, and we will follow up. Please follow the links as well for further information about this campaign that Lewis has posted. Local groups, including PSC branches, and we now have nearly 80 branches in towns and cities across the UK, will be taking regular actions outside Barclays Bank's locations, both to protest against their complicity, but also to talk to their customers about the campaign. So please do visit the website, find your local branch, become involved. If you yourself are a Barclays customer, there is a template letter you can hand in to your local bank's manager demanding that they divest from apartheid, and the link for that, I believe, is in the chat. I want to end just by reflecting, I think, on something Badur said earlier about the spirit of the Palestinian people and about the mood of the Palestinian people at the moment. And I want to say something about all of our moods, because in the last week we've had one of those moments again when we are faced with the overwhelming immediate brutality of what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people, and we are all conscious that that can generate not just a sense of anger, but sometimes a sense of despair, because the forces that continue to support this system of injustice sometimes feel overwhelming. And I think we are all in a sense of despair at the familiar, appalling response we've seen from our political leaders. I want to share just some words of two Palestinians with you that struck me. One, something that was written this week by Mariam Barghouti, a Palestinian writer and activist. She wrote this week in response to what's been happening in Gaza. She said this: heartbreak. That's the mood of Palestine. Heartbreak and a deep yearning to stop having what little pieces of us survive keep being broken down until there is nothing left but dust. But what she also said is that the events and what we have seen from the events of the past few days, they have also reminded us that the Palestinian people will never, and as Badur said, can never give up their resistance, never give up their struggle for justice and self-determination. Mahmoud Darwish, the national poet of Palestine, once said this. He said, Palestinians want just what everybody else wants. They want to live ordinary lives, but when a person is deprived of their homeland, then they are obliged to become a slave to that homeland and to its liberation. The oppression of the Palestinian people is not possible without the complicity of Western governments, public bodies that continue to invest in complicit companies, and those complicit companies themselves. Our job as solidarity activists is to tackle that complicity directly and to target those companies for actions. The Palestinian people will never cease to resist, but they demand, they deserve, they need the ongoing support of the solidarity movement. So thank you, all of you, for coming. Those of you who are in London, please join us tomorrow at Downing Street when we will be calling again for an end to apartheid, an end to the occupation, and for the UK government to stop arming Israel. If you're in Manchester or Birmingham or Liverpool, if you go on the PSC website, you'll see details of protests that are also going to be taking place, led by PSC branches in those towns and cities. Please join this campaign. We look forward to working alongside you, onwards and forward together to freedom, justice, and equality.